webinar series focused on community-defined practices brought to you by the California Institute for Behavioral Health Solutions Health Equity Team. We would like to thank our sponsors, the Mental Health Services Act and the Department of Healthcare Services, for supporting this webinar series. Our webinar today is entitled Articulating Community-Defined Practice Models. It is a privilege to have with us today our presenter, Dr. William Rhett Mariscal. Dr. Rhett Mariscal is an Associate Director with the Health Equity Team at the California Institute for Behavioral Health Solutions. As a lead in providing technical assistance in the area of reducing disparities and the primary point person at the agency in the Prevention and Early Intervention component of the California Mental Health Services Act. He was part of a team helping LA County develop and conduct their community-defined evidence program identification process for PEI programs, providing technical assistance to agencies, helping them articulate their practice models in a way that would allow Los Angeles planning areas to select a practice for implementation by local providers. He has also been involved in several practice dissemination and implementation support projects, working with program developers and agencies, learning and implementing programs. At this time, it is my pleasure to turn it over to Dr. Will Rhett Mariscal.
Thank you, May, and good morning, everyone. Thank you all for joining us. Hope you all had a good Thanksgiving break, and I appreciate your flexibility being able to join us this morning. And begin in working more in depth in this module on articulating community-defined practices, on how you articulate your practice models. Just to let you know, we are still in the process of talking to folks on the phone. It's taken a little longer, so but we are starting to send back our reports to everyone, so you should be getting those if you haven't already shortly. And we look forward to helping partner with you and see how you advance the articulation of your practice model, both through this webinar, which is a more in-depth overview of the topic, but also through a regional meeting where you will have an opportunity to hear from a community provider, a developer who has developed several practices that were recognized in LA County PI programs. So you'll get to hear specifically from their expertise, and also have opportunity to get feedback on your articulation. So in addition, you'll have opportunity to get technical assistance. So this is beginning to get deeper from that first webinar that we had, which was a general overview of the 3 areas, and this is focusing on this area. And hopefully it will start moving your practice further in terms of articulation. So just in case we have some folks on here who maybe you've invited other folks from your community who have not heard some of the earlier webinars, I'm just going to go over very quickly the background context out of which this discussion is happening. This presentation is grounded in. And then we'll get right into the 2 areas that we will focus on in terms of articulating your practice. That's articulating your theory of change, and then the model itself. And we'll get into more detail into the components, what it means, how to do it, and even have some time for you to be starting to work on that during this webinar. So if you have a chance, I recommend that you, if you don't already have paper and pen, paper and pencil, keyboard, or something on hand, because there'll be some time for you to do a little bit of a practical response to the material presented. And then I'll wrap up at the end with next steps, which will talk about where we go from here to continue to move further in terms of refining the articulation of your practice. So I'd like to point out again, as May said at the beginning, that you have an opportunity to ask questions. Please do so at any point in time. and if I have a chance, I'll be able to answer them as we're moving along, and then also I will spend additional time at the end to see if there's any questions, additional questions that didn't get answered along the way that should be answered. So please, even though we have you on mute, to protect the quality of the recording and not have a background noise or hold music or other things that happen when we have people unmuted, we do want you to feel free to chat with us, send questions, raise your hand, do different things that you can do through that control panel so that this will be more interactive. Okay, great. Oh, and I will be asking you to respond to some questions I'll be asking later. So there'll be a time where I'll be specifically inviting you to participate. Okay, well with that, let's get into the brief, I don't want to go into too much repetition here, but a brief overview of the context that we're working from in this presentation, and that is this definition of community-defined evidence. This comes out of, this is a national, this paper here is a report on national work that's happened that's partially sponsored by SAMHSA and the National Network for Eliminating Disparities. And Martinez, Callejas, and Hernandez, Ken Martinez, Linda Callejas, and Mario Hernandez did the first project to identify community-defined evidence practices for the Latino community, and they published some of their results, and they've also been looking at, they've also been writing on the topic. So, but this definition has been around since about 2007, and it was incorporated in the Prevention and Early Intervention Resource Guide of Practices that was released in California when the draft guidelines for the Mental Health Service Act Prevention and Early Intervention component was released. So this is the definition that some folks in California have been using as well. It's a national definition, a California definition, and at least in the work that we were doing in prevention and early intervention. And one of the things I want to kind of point out about it in this paraphrase of the definition is that these are distinct practices, so that are used by a group with a common heritage. So we're not talking about the practices that an individual uses or an individual develops. We're talking about kind of group practices, those that come from a group of people with a shared heritage and shared interests, and that members of that group have found that this practice has good results based on any kind of information that they have gathered, whether it's you know, through subjective, objective measures, different ways of finding that it works, but they have a general agreement in that community that this practice has good results. So that's what we're working from, this understanding of a discrete, concrete practice that is something that is tied to a cultural heritage group with a common understanding that this recognition that this practice works. And of course, in that definition, we are definitely talking about, I want to make sure we're explicit about it, we're talking about an understanding that healing is culturally grounded, and that depending on your worldview, which is your perspective from which you interpret the world and your set of beliefs about the world, you people define illness and wellness differently and what healing looks like differently. So this is you know, honoring and recognizing that there are different understandings of what is an illness and what is healing and what is wellness, and community-defined practices are grounded in worldviews, and we want to make that clear and explicit. Okay, so that's the background that we are bringing to addressing this. I see that, Sinead, you have raised your hand. Can you type your question if you have a question right now? I don't know if that was intentional or sometimes it's an accidental click on a hand. So if you have a question, feel free to type in a question. And if not, I'll move on now from the background to the next section. Okay, I'm not seeing anything yet, so I will move on. And if not, if I have a chance later, I will address it if there was a question. Okay, So the other piece I wanted just to mention, the other last assumption here, and we brought this up before, is that we're also working on the assumption that we recognize that culturally based practices could get total support without needing any kind of justification, and that would be great for those instances when that can be accomplished. And that is one way of getting culturally based practices funded. There are other instances where you'll get funding for community-defined practices where you'll need some kind of translation, where the funders want to know more about what it is what the practice is about, and what's it trying to do, and how does it work. And so in those cases, your funders are not accepting just wholeheartedly just giving the money over for the practice, but they're saying, well, tell me more about it. And so when you're doing that, then we're going to look at that kind of like as a translation, where you have to articulate the practice model and the theory of change, and present evidence of effectiveness, whatever evidence that you have, present that. And that's the assumption that we're working from here, that those of you who are participating in this training are looking for assistance in doing that translation. Also, we pointed out that others might get funded to disseminate the practice, not just to do it themselves, and so then that takes another step in dissemination protocol. And when I talk about the work that happened in LA County, you'll see how that one really was focused on this issue of dissemination as well, and how that impacts how the practice had to be articulated and all of that. You'll see when we get there. Okay, so with that, I'd like to move forward and address these two areas that we're going to be talking about. One is the theory of change, which is the explanation of the how you go from some kind of imbalance or illness or state of need to a state of strength, wellness, and resilience. That's what the theory of change is talking about. It's kind of the what happens and the why that happens of a practice. And then the articulation of the model, the other thing that we'll talk about, is really all the details, which includes the theory of change, but it's the who does it, what do they do, how do they do it, when they do it, and all the kind of concrete details of the practice itself. So those are the two areas that you might be called to talk about in your practice, just the core of what are you doing, why, the theory of change, and then a more detailed presentation of the whole practice model itself. So with that, let's look at the first one, the theory of change. Okay, so we're coming from the perspective here that treatment and also prevention practices should have some kind of following elements to them. No matter what the worldview that the practice comes from, there's some understanding that there's some problem that is being addressed by the practice. So that should be fundamental. So think about your practice and think about kind of that question of what is the problem that is being addressed in some way, whether it's being treated or prevented, but some basic core element that this is for something. What's the practice for? Then secondly, there's this element of understanding of what is needed to address this problem, prevent the problem, address this issue. So when you think of a practice, you go, oh, well, this is for this thing, and this is what needs to be done. This is what is done to do it. So that's the second part. And then the last part is the why part. So that's what we're talking about when we talk about a theory of change. We're talking about really these core components of saying, hey, what's it for, what is done, and why. Okay, so when you articulate the theory of change, we'll be asking you to answer these questions. But we're not going to do that yet. We're going to hold off a little bit on it, and we're going to talk about, I'm going to give some examples first. and then we'll give a chance to answer any questions and then actually do some preliminary articulation of the theory of change. So here's an example I want to give you of one practice. This is a practice that I'm going to tell you the purpose of this practice in part is to address children who are not eating and have difficulty sleeping. So if you tell me that there's a child who's not eating and has difficulty sleeping, I've got this practice for you, practice number 1. What do we do with this practice? Well, what we do is we provide that child with antidepressant medications. That's what's done. And why? Well, we do that because we believe that the child has depression, which we understand to be a chemical imbalance in the brain. By the way, when I say we, I'm taking the perspective of the community that has created this practice. And I'll do that for all the different practices I'm going to give examples for. I'm not actually literally talking about myself. I'm just giving an example of how I would be articulating the theory of change. So I would say that then what we believe is that there's a chemical imbalance of the brain that affects the desire to eat and cause sleep disturbance. So the answer then is we give these medications that correct that chemical imbalance, and that should change the eating patterns and the sleep disturbance. So that's the theory of change for this practice. What it's for, what is done, and the reason. Now, there can be so much, this could go so much more in detail, but a brief explanation, concise explanation of theory of change is helpful. You can get into the detail when you really articulate your model. You can get into all the components of what you need to do and you know, how you have to titrate the medications, maybe switch, and maybe how you need to add other components. And you can get into much more detail, but just a concise explanation of what this practice is about in terms of the theory of change like this is good for a good way of articulating what your practice is about. Okay, now I'm a developer of another practice. I'm just going to call it practice number 2. Or developer or someone who's helping articulate this practice and disseminate this practice. And this practice is also for children who are not eating, have difficulty sleeping. If you tell me there's a child in my community that is not eating or difficulty sleeping, what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask to have a curandero, a shaman, come and do a barrida, a sweeping. So why do I do that? Well, because we believe that the child has susto, and that when that happens, the child has had a frightening thing that has happened in their life that has caused their soul to leave their body. And so what we need to do is bring the soul back. And that's what the curandero does with their healing ceremony, is they help bring the soul back. So that's my practice number 2. Again, that's very concise. I can get into more detail in terms of what actually happens in the curandero ceremony. I can get into more detail about how often it might need to happen, a lot more. But that's the articulation of the practice. This is just the core, the theory of change, the what's it for, what is done, and why. What's the change that's happening in the person that we're providing the practice to. Okay, is that getting clear, hopefully? Let's do the third one. This is going to be a prevention practice. Those are more treatment practices. So now I'm a developer, disseminator of this practice. I'm calling it practice number 3. And this one is also for children who are not eating and have difficulty sleeping. But I'm going to get a little more specific here. And this is for children in that situation who are about, between 12 and 15. What I do for children in that situation is, well, I will take them through a rite of passage ceremony. And the reason why we do this is because we believe that as a child reaches this age, they're starting to develop a sense of responsibility and an awareness of issues around them, and they start to worry, and they might feel disconnected. As they're getting older, they're changing from a child and becoming an adult, and that transition can be complicated and can cause disturbances if not supported correctly. So we believe that what's really essential is we need to strengthen the youth connection to community by showing them that the community is committed to them and that's one thing that we do in a rite of passage ceremony, which is a community ceremony that includes the youth and shows that they are recognized and connected to the community. We also want them individually to feel that they have successfully completed this transition into adulthood. So we want to give them a sense of competence and also of new direction, of recognizing that there's a new situation. We believe that if we do that, we can take a youth who's having these symptoms of disconnectedness and wandering, worrying, and really channel that and change that into someone who is an adult and begins to take care of the situation. So that's what the theory of change of this practice is. Okay, I want to talk about one additional component that I think is important for us to look at when we talk about articulating the theory of change. And that is, I want to talk a little more explicitly about translation from cultural worldviews. So here's a recommendation that we have that for you to consider, and that is so we're considering this articulating the theory of change as a translation practice, but as translating your practice into a way that can be recognized by the systems that might fund you. But we want you to feel confident in starting fully within your the cultural worldview of the practice, really articulating it, like for example, like I did of Susto, articulating within that cultural worldview without having to translate that to anything else in the beginning. Then you can think about, so when you do your theory of change, you can do it within your cultural worldview. It's just the idea of presenting it like a theory of change. That's what the translation activity is. Presenting in that simple way of, what's it for, what is done, and why. That's translation activity. But I'm not suggesting that you need to strip it from its cultural context. So that's what we want to say. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't draw parallels. If we go back to the Susto, you can explain it entirely within the cultural worldview, or you might say, this is how it is within the cultural worldview. It's about Susto. And then you could say, so this is similar to when children experience traumatic incidences and they have some form of traumatic response. So you can start using language that is similar or analogous, or that kind of is equal to from the Western system perspective, but don't feel a need to completely remove it from your cultural explanation as you do that. So I want to give you an example, another example. I did Susto, but let me give you an example of, here's a recommendation that you don't have to go so far. So let me give you an example from drumming. So from a Native American perspective, drumming is the heartbeat of the community, brings the community together, and many more elements that I haven't accurately captured here. And if there are participants on the call who want to tell us more, on the webinar, who want to tell us more about this from cultural worldview, please feel free to type that in. But the point I just wanted to make is that there are there's a researcher in UCLA who's a Native American, but he has been looking at the brainwaves associated with drumming, and found that brainwave research shows that the drumming promotes positive brainwaves. Now, he's not doing this at all, what I wanted to say next, but I just want to say, so if you had a practice like this and you found something that seemed very, Western, brainwaves, you might feel that to translate it to get funding, that you might have to go and strip it completely of its cultural context and say, this is a brainwave training practice, and just completely remove it from the cultural context at all, and just use entirely the kind of a Western scientific approach. And here's an example for you. And I'm recommending that you don't feel the need to do that. And the researcher in UCLA is not doing that either. But I just wanted to give you an example of how you could go too far in the translation and try to strip it from its cultural value. Then it wouldn't quite come across as a community-defined practice anymore, because you've kind of completely stripped it away of its cultural worldview and context. So just a recommendation, think about it as translation, but don't feel the need to go all the way. And kind of preserve the cultural understanding, the cultural explanation in the theory of change of why this practice works. So it's okay to talk about it as bringing the soul back to the body and things like that. Okay, so I want to pause because we're going to move into a time where I'd like you to work on this for a second. So I want to pause and see questions that I have. And just a second, I'm needing to read this question. Oh, okay, so I see. Okay, the question was what I was just addressing right now. Okay, so we're good. Okay, thank you, Lisa. Hopefully that was good. I had a question asking, to what extent should the why reflect the community's explanation? And then that's exactly what I was just addressing now. I recommend that you do reflect the community's explanation. If you can draw analogies to help people understand, then that's okay, but community-defined practice, you want to really honor the cultural worldview, I believe. Okay, so now, what we'd like you to do is, if there are no other questions right now, which I'm not seeing any, I'd like you to take a few minutes and just in a quick and simple, just in a few words, like I did on the examples, jot down what your practice is for, what is done, and why. And then I'd like you to post it in either the question section or post it in the question section so we can see what you have. So take a few minutes and think about your practice and just tell us in a simplified version, very just concise right now, what is the core problem, issue, and imbalance the practice addresses. Very concisely talk about what is done to address the issue and then the why from the cultural perspective of why that addresses the issue. Okay? And we'll be waiting a little bit while you're working on that. And when you're done, go ahead and submit it via the question section so we can all share these and then we can discuss it. For those who are listening to this webinar, it will seem a little strange to have this silence, so that's why I am talking through the silence a little bit, because if anyone's going to be listening to the recorded webinar later, you don't want it to have a lot of empty space. Okay, we're starting to get some answers, articulating the practice. So what it's for, what is done, and the why. Okay, we'll keep going a little longer. Oh, good, and we had someone else just join us. The person who just joined us, we are doing, oops, this moved, but we are answering these questions here and submitting them through the question feature of the webinar. I'm looking forward to hearing from everyone. Just a quick answer to these questions for your practice. Okay, good. We got more coming in. That's great, and I'll try to piece them together and share them with all and see if you have any comments or questions as we go through this exercise once we get a few more here. Haven't heard from everyone yet. Okay, great. More coming in. Okay, I'm still missing a couple people I haven't heard from yet. So looking forward to getting your answers. Okay, good. I think we've almost got complete answers from everyone who's answered so far. And we're still missing from a couple people. Okay. Okay, good. And I'm hearing from some more people. That's good. Just this way we can have a discussion. I know it's strange having the discussion through questions, but just be able to get into this a little more. Okay, I think what I'll do, I've heard from almost everyone. There's just still a couple of people I haven't heard from. But why don't I start reviewing what I've received. So in some cases it means I have to piece together the different answers, but hopefully you all, I'm not sure if you all are able, I will read them to make sure that people will know what the questions are. Certainly people who are listening to a recording will not know what these are. So let's begin with Bruce, and Bruce will be able to add additional comments as I go along and explain this. Okay, so for the Bruce, we have as what for? It's for eliminating a stigma by eliminating mental health stigma. I'm going to summarize that just briefly, Bruce, because say eliminating mental health stigma by building capacity for direct care services is a PI WET initiative. So in terms of the theory of change, it's always good to just kind of just simplify and say, you know, what does this address? This is address stigma, it also seeks to establish social connection among citizens. So reduces stigma and establishes social connection. So what's it for? We're going to translate that. What is the problem or issue and balance this addresses? It addresses stigma and disconnected citizens, or yeah, let's say disconnected community members. Okay, then we move from there, and Bruce says that what is done to address that is is that in the program they address different social determinants that overwhelm the youth that help cause dysfunction. So that's kind of the why. And so why, the idea is to increase productive citizens. So kind of address these social determinants which have caused, the belief is that these different social determinants have caused dysfunction as the youth are trying to navigate through unfortunate circumstances. So this is a practice that tries to address. So I was going to rephrase that a little bit. I'd say it tries to address youth who are who could be having challenges or might have challenge navigating the difficult circumstances, and what is done is an intervention to address the social determinants that overwhelm the youth, and in that way build productive systems. Does that sound good, Bruce? Okay, great. Let me move to the next one. Let's go with SINATE. So with SINATE, you start, the issue that this is addressing is a high suicide rate in the community. So what is done is outreach and education to the community members. And the why is because there is there's an understanding that there is stigma in the community, strong stigma for addressing mental health issues. And so people do not get the help they need. They don't access services. And so there's a need to reduce, so then there's this need to do this kind of community connection work, outreach and support. Did that sound, how did that sound, Sinead? Was that correct? Okay, good. Good, and I know I'm doing some paraphrasing of what you guys have written. I'm trying to make it as succinct on the fly as I can, just to give you a sense that it can be a pretty succinct definition of your theory of change, and you can get in more detail when you go into the actual articulating the model. So now let's move to Lisa. Lisa is talking about a practice that is for youth substance abuse, school disengagement, and antisocial engagement. So youth who are dealing with substance use issues and struggling with school and hanging out with people that they shouldn't be. Okay, so what is done? Cultural healing circles are done. Particularly one called the Joven Noble curriculum, which okay. And it goes into more detail about what is done, but it involves connection with indigenous art, music, and movement and mindfulness. The reason why this is done is because there's a belief that the youth need to reconnect with their cultural, with their cultural identity and the cultural strengths and practices. And that this, because it is believed that the youth who are going through these challenges are going through traumatic experiences, and they need these resources in order to be able to successfully navigate them. Does that sound good, Lisa? Okay, great. And where are So I've done Lisa. Okay, now Winona. Okay, so the issue that this practice addresses is Black college grads having poor birth outcomes. So it's addressing poor birth outcomes. What is done is creating a community around motherhood and a balance between work and the life. And the reason is to create this community around mothers is because there's a understanding that there is a too much focus on stress in the community and not in terms of strength and resilience, and so that young mothers need support around strength and resilience and have this community around them, and then that will help achieve better birth outcomes. Was that correct, Winona? Is that a good summary? I'm trying to give an example of how I'm making them concise. Okay, and while I wait to hear from Winona, let me move on to the last one that we have received. There's still a couple others we have not received, but I'll go over the ones that we have received. So this is from Summer. And okay, and this is, what's it for? It's for youth, young Native Americans. What is done is traditional kind of classes and groups, so the youth come together around traditional activities. And the reason is to help them connect to their culture, to help build self-esteem and a connection to the community. So the reason is that understanding that youth are feeling disconnected from their community and might have low self-esteem, so it's important to connect them to their culture and to other Native Americans in the community so that they can build that self-esteem and that community connection and then successfully navigate into being a young adult. Was that a good summary, Summer? While I'm waiting to hear from Summer and Winona, I've got another one coming in as well. Okay, Summer clarified that this is not just for youth, but it's for all ages. And they have some youth-specific classes, but essentially this practice addresses youth and adults in trying to address the social disconnection that they might have and the lack of positive self-esteem and positive cultural identity. Okay, and then Gulshan is, we're still getting some of these answers in, but essentially this is a practice that what it's for is for addressing stigma and helping a community understand about mental health issues. What is done is a series of religious talks are given where references are made to the Quran for the Muslim community. So it's really addressing, tying their, oops, I'm getting into the reason why. So that's the practice. So it's address this need for mental health focus and address stigma by having these talks called kopas that make references to the Quran for the Muslim community. And the reason why this is done, the last piece, Gulshan. Because this is the main piece where the community has connection at the mosque, at the religious centers. So by working through the religious community centers, that's a way to really help address this issue in the community. Okay, good. I think I heard from all almost everyone, and that's and we can move forward. Now, comments that I'm getting here, so that's good. Let's have some discussion around what you think about this little exercise just to get you started. We have one comment from Sinesh that says that we can always emphasize on what makes the practice different than other outreach and engagement by focusing on culturally and linguistic appropriate education. So she's making a point about her practice, that if it's an outreach and engagement practice, it might not sound, if you just translate it and you say this is outreach and engagement, I think that's what you're saying, Sinead. If you just say it's outreach and engagement, then it might not sound like a community-defined practice per se. It's just this is how we do outreach and engagement in this community. But to make it really a community-defined practice that comes from the community, it's important to focus on those culturally and linguistic appropriate topics and issues related to the community. I think that's the comment that you're saying, Sinead. Okay, good. Any other observations, questions, comments about this exercise? This initial stab at coming up with the theory of change before we move on? Okay, well then great. I hope that has been helpful. Let's move on and now go to the next section, which is more detailed, focus on articulating the practice. So, the theory of change is part of articulating your practice, but as I hope I was able to show, it's a really concise explanation of the core of what is happening, the core of the transformation, the core of the change, and why the practice is important or needed for the change. And the rest of articulating a practice is really getting into the how to do it, the who, how, what, when, all the kind of details of what actually happens in the practice. And I just wanted to point out that, of course, cultures have different traditions. Some are more oral tradition and oral-based, and others are written-based. When we talk about our system world that we're working in, that comes from a written tradition, the funders, and there's a language that is used for practices, a term that's used for practices, and that's called manualizing the practice. So that term refers to the concept of writing down the practice in a manual so that someone could pick it up and do it. Now, if your practice comes from an oral tradition, that would seem very different. You're not used to manualizing the practice. The concept of having a manual, a written, like a recipe book or cookbook on how to do the practice might seem very against kind of the way things are done within your practice. But so I just wanted to call that out, that some folks, some funders, will want to know if your practice has been manualized or have some confidence around it being articulated in a written format. And that's just a reflection of the Western tradition that those funders are coming from. Okay, so now what are some of the components that you can get into in more detail in terms of articulating the practice beyond the theory of change? Well, defining who the practice is for. You can call that the target population. Sometimes when practices, I'll show you some examples of an example of a listing of a practice, and you'll see that people might ask, define the target population for this practice. Who's the practice for? That it really helps sometimes to answer that question, to think of it who it's not for. So when we were doing the example, the activity that we were doing before, when I talked about the practice that we heard from Soscall, and I had misunderstood that to be for youth, and I defined that as being for youth, and got corrected, and that was not just for youth. If that's what you're looking at, when when you say who it's for, you're also thinking about who it's not for. So when you say it's for youth, like I did, I was implying that it was not for adults, and I was wrong. So you want to say this is for youth and adults. You want to say it's for males, it's for females, it's for teenagers, it's for people with these certain symptoms or these certain conditions or a certain situation. Even thinking about when it's okay or not okay. If you think of like a medical procedure, let's say a cancer treatment, you would say, well, who's it for? It's for people with cancer, right? But there's certain, but you can define it even more and say, but only if they have, if they have this kind of strength, indicators of strength, then this treatment is appropriate. If not, then we have to use a different treatment. So kind of understanding the practice even from when it's okay, not okay to use the practice. Is it used for all people who meet the target population criteria, no matter what conditions, or under certain conditions? So really thinking about that, who it's for, when it's, and when in that person's life, or in their symptomology, or with what conditions is it appropriate for them. Another thing that people really look for understanding about a practice and looking for when you articulate the practice is to really understand what it's for, like we said in the theory of change. But one way that that's articulated is by stating the intended outcomes of the practice. What are the goals that you have? You do this practice for what? What are you hoping to see happen? It's often helpful to articulate kind of by when, too. So you say, well, by engaging in this practice, we expect the participant to have X, Y, and Z happen by, within a day, within a week, within 2 months, within a year. So it's good to refine your goals, your intended outcomes of the practice by also stating kind of a time frame for them. Then there's the core of your articulating of your practice, and that's getting down to the details of what is done and what's the sequence and the actual, how to go about the practice, the steps that are taken, the activities that you see, the practice components. The other thing that people really like to look at when they look at practices and they review them is they want to understand who the practitioners are, or the healers of the practice. Who can be a practitioner? Is there only one practitioner? Are there multiple practitioners? Going back to a medical model again, just as an example, some practices will require, like surgery will require a surgeon, but it will also require nurses and other staff are required to carry out that procedure. So there's not just one practitioner, but it's more practitioners of different skill sets. So being able to define whether you need what practitioners do you need? Do you need supervisors? Do you need managers of the practitioners to make this practice work? And thinking about all the different people that are needed to make the practice work. What are their qualifications that are needed? How do you choose someone? How do you train them? What skills do they need to be able to do those different roles? That's important, something that people look at. The other thing that sometimes is helpful to articulate about a practice is its location or setting. If something has to be carried out in a very specific setting, that's important for people to know that. Sorry, excuse me. But there are some things that could be done anywhere, some things that have to be only in special healing locations or in clinic locations or a certain environment. So specifying that is helpful as well. So these are some of the things that you can talk about when you are articulating your practice. And we're going to go in more detail in this. Now, let me pause and I've got some questions that have come up, so let me see if I can address some of these questions. So I've got one about a question about the issue of manualizing a practice. And I think the question from Lisa, and you can answer me if I'm correct, is you're asking about where having a manual for the practice reflects the community tradition or value. So you're asking about manualizing and providing an example of a community-defined practice that values manualizing, where that community itself believes it's important to write things down and have a manualized way of doing it. That's a great question, Lisa, because I think it's almost it's like I'm going to give you an example from LA in just a couple slides, and I'm going to show you how LA really valued. Actually, the next slide, I'm going to show you how LA County really valued manualizing a practice and why. So I'll give you an example there. But traditions that value will certainly, in the Western tradition, coming out of Western community, there's a valuing of manualizing the practice. And the idea behind manualizing the practice is this value that the community has of trying to guarantee the same results or try to have a consistency in the practice. So I'm not sure I'm not sure what other communities value manualizing a practice. I think that's a good question to ask. So I don't know. It's a good question, Lisa. I don't know what other communities have that value. I think I would want to ask our participants too right now to see if they value it. But if not, then we're really talking about that this is an aspect of translation. Manualizing a practice is something that is not within a community's value, but it is within the kind of the funder's value. And so that's where, when we create a manual, we recognize that that's if you choose to do that, you recognize that you're doing that translation. But I want to give a chance, not familiar with communities that value, other communities that value writing the practice down or manualizing the practice. I mean, I can tell you, for example, that the Joven Noble program is manualized based on my understanding. So let's have was that you, Lisa, who's talking about the Joven Noble program? Let me see who's talking about that. Yes, Lisa, you're talking about the Joven Noble program. So to some extent, and we're hoping the developers will be part of the technical assistance that's provided. So we might ask them later on why they manualized the practice and why that was important for them to manualize the practice. Either it was just in response to funders, or there was some inherent value in the community that felt that it was good to create a manual to guide how the work is done. I think, Lisa, I can't give you more examples, but I think it's a good question in terms of really recognizing that sometimes this idea of manualizing is part of that translation practice. And there's some communities who might feel that they just don't want to do that, or that's not where they want to go with this. And I think that's part of it. We're trying to, in a sense, translate our practice enough so that funders will accept it, but also trying to stake a claim and say, this is as far as we can go with this practice, and finding that balance and kind of trying to gain the respect for where the practice is, but also looking at to what extent can you move the practice in a direction where it can be accepted and funded. Does anyone else have any other comments or questions around that issue of manualizing the practice? Yeah, so Sine is asking a question, wanting to know a little more about what manualizing the practice is. She asked, is it reporting the steps, how the practice has been done, so the practice can be duplicated as a regular practice? Yes, that's what we're talking about. Actually, manualizing the practice would in some level be this thing that we're talking about articulating. But what's different what's different when people talk about manualizing it is they think about, see, writing this all down right here, answering all these questions that we have here, is telling someone what is being done. But a manual is often used as a guide for training new people how to do it. So it is what you're saying, Sinead. It isn't more about how it can be duplicated as a regular practice. And I'm wondering, Sinead, if you have yourself been engaged in that for the practice that you were involved in. I think the Ethiopian community has valued the written explanation of the practice, and so that might be a good example. So, is that correct, Sinead, or not? Because I have seen materials that you've given me that do look like there's value. Yes. Okay. So Lisa, we have one example, and it's from the Ethiopian community. Sinead is telling us that in their community they have really valued writing down kind of the steps of how to do the practice that they were doing so that it can be duplicated and carried out throughout the community by other practitioners. Jaime is asking if you can have access to speak to respond. We're having a conversation through chat. I apologize. I know that's hard, but it just if we open up the line, we might suddenly get all this feedback. So, Jaime, can you add some additional comments? Jaime's been involved with the Joven Noble program, and you can maybe talk about your experience of manualizing the practice and why you've done that for your community. We'll give Jaime a little bit of a chance to type his answer. I apologize that we have to do it this way, but we've just found in the past it's just too complicated with the phone systems not working well. And it causes a lot of distractions. So bear with us as we wait for Jaime to type in his response. Okay, let's see. Still waiting for Jaime's response, but I think that will give us another example of a community that has chosen to kind of manualize their practice for the purpose of duplicating the practice. Well, while we're waiting for Jaime, let me move on, and we will come back to that once we get his answer. Because I wanted to give you this example from LA County. I'm going to move now into giving you some examples from LA County DMH. I wanted to give you some concrete examples. This is a solicitation that Los Angeles County Department of Mental Health did for the Prevention and Early Intervention component of the Mental Health Services Act. They wanted to create a guide of practices that could be chosen by their planning areas for implementation in the different planning areas. That's how they divide up the county. And so they needed to create a guide, and it had evidence-based practices, and they want to have community-defined evidence practices. So for that purpose of this guide of practices that the different planning areas could choose to implement in their area, they said that they needed practices that were sufficiently well developed and described that are teachable to other agencies and that are delivered in a consistent manner. I added the red to highlight to show you kind of what they were focusing on. So for their purposes, It really was to find a practice of community-defined evidence, but that was ready to be implemented in different areas by different people, not necessarily the people who developed it in one part of LA, but it might be implemented in another part of LA where that agency or that community didn't have a presence, and so they would have to teach it to someone else. So for that purpose, they wanted a practice that was enough described or articulated that it could be taught to other people. They also wanted some level of effectiveness, and then this is what they said. They said if a developer cannot clearly say what the core components of the practice are, what the results of the practice are, and how they know those results, how they know that the practice has some results, if they can't explain how they know why it works, or how it works, I mean why it works, or that it does work, I mean, then they can't teach others, and then they can't teach others the practice, then it wasn't ready for inclusion in the resource guide. So here's a concrete example of the first county in California to request community-defined evidence practices. And this is what they were looking for. This was the standard they were looking for their purposes. Now, that doesn't mean that other funders won't look for practices in a different way. But I just wanted to give you an example, a real based example of a request for community-defined practices. Okay. Let me see if we've gotten from Jaime. Yes, so Jaime talked about that they use curriculums to standardize the teachings, maintain fidelity to the model for teaching purposes, and keeping the teachings clear, and to be able to call it, that we need as much as we can to keep the teachings true to the values and concepts. People who don't manualize their teachings run the risk of having their teachings changed through different styles and when the teachings are not maintained to fidelity. Okay, so here you have very clear, another example, Lisa, of a community who really felt that manualizing, writing the steps of the practice down was essential to transmitting the practice and maintaining the integrity and the fidelity to the practice. Thank you, Jaime. Appreciate it. And sorry for the frustration of having to rely through this the typing. But when we have the regional meetings, we'll definitely be able to talk. Okay. I'm going to move on with some more examples from this LA process. And then we'll move into, again, further discussion on articulation and a little exercise around articulation, just a brief exercise. And then we'll wrap up for today for this presentation. So let's move on. I wanted to show you in that solicitation that happened in LA how these different components were defined. I think this information will be useful for you because you might choose some of this guidance that was given to the community agencies in Los Angeles to help you articulate your practice. So I wanted to share this with you. I've highlighted some of the elements that I thought might be helpful for you to think about as you articulate your practice, and you can refer back to these slides in the future as you work on articulating your practice. So for target population, here's the guidance, asking these questions. Does a practice focus on a particular cultural group or subgroup? Which group or subgroup is it? So define the cultural group or the subgroup. Say what that is when you talk about your target population. Is it provided in a language in English? If so, let people know this is a practice that is done. This is provided in this is provided for Spanish speakers. This is provided for Hmong speakers. This is provided for, Cambodian speakers, Vietnamese speakers. Is it focused on a certain age group? Is it focused only on males or females, or people with a specific need or risk, or people in a particular area or setting? Is it for, so those are some ways that you can define your target population. Again, you can come back and look at this, but I just want to give you an idea of how detailed you can get in defining who the practice is for. And in defining your intended outcomes, which in LA County they call them the goals, or here the intended results of the practice, since that solicitation was focused on MHSA, prevention and early intervention, the requirements of what they were looking for were kind of geared to what the requirements were by the state around prevention and early intervention. So they break out the intended results in terms of kind of prevention and early intervention here. And so they ask you if it's about prevention, then what is it that it's preventing? What are the specific mental illness and or mental health problems that are prevented by the practice? So that's one way that you can articulate your intended goal if it's a prevention practice. When you're talking about prevention, you also can talk about protective factors and risk factors. It's the language that's used in the system, in the provider system, systems to talk about prevention. So protective factors are these things that protect people from developing a mental illness, and risk factors are the things that could increase one's likelihood of developing a mental illness. So prevention practices sometimes target specific protective factors. They increase those protective factors or they reduce risk factors. So in LA, they were asking people to talk about that. If the practice had that, if it built protective factors or reduced risk factors, to list what those are. Maybe there's some other prevention goals that the practice has, like, increasing health awareness, like some of the examples we've had today. So list what those goals are, intended outcomes are of the practice. Now, if it's an early intervention, and those are practices that are like treatments, but they're early treatments, so they address the mental illness early on, once in its manifestation, when someone begins to have that mental illness. So, what's the mental illness that it addresses early, and what does it do? How does it improve their mental state? So it does improve their thinking, their behavior, their emotions, etc. So that's how LA was recommending that people define what the intended outcomes are or the goals of their practice by thinking in terms of this prevention and early intervention. Now, some of you might have a practice that is a treatment practice, so then you would talk about what is it that's actually treating, and so what is the goal of that? Complete disappearance of the problem, or just some kind of improvement of the problem. So you want to articulate your goal. Then they talked about the core components. People who were responding to this request for practices had to get listed in the resource guide, had to talk about the kind of what's done. And then here's some recommendations that I wanted to pass on to you from this that you can look at. If you look at the what's in red, the essential components of the practice is the activities, steps, stages, procedures, things that must happen for it to work. They have here kind of the reason for these essential components. This is where they've woven in the theory of change in this part. The way that a new practitioner learns how to do this practice, they think it's helpful to talk about how people are trained. They wanted you to articulate the number of sessions that are needed. Maybe, like, for example, with susto, it's not necessarily done with just one session with a curandero, but you might say takes 3 to 5 or 2 to 4, give some sense of how many sessions are needed to complete the practice, how often sessions occur. Do they occur, once every day, twice in a day? Should you do it once a week? What's the natural spacing for your practice between sessions if it takes more than a session, and how long does a session usually last? And how long are services provided? Is this something that's done for a year, done for 6 months, done for a month, done for a week, done for a day? These are some ideas of things that you can do to really get more concrete in terms of talking about your practice. About the practitioners, we've already talked about this a little bit, but here, the minimum number of people practitioners needed to provide the practice. Some practices require, at least 2, 3 people. It can't be done with just one. Or some practices, all they need is one. Does this practitioner need to be bicultural, bilingual? List what languages and cultures are needed if that's a requirement of practitioners. What are the role and responsibilities of each practitioner needed? So, what does each one do? And the minimum requirements for each practitioner to be able to provide the practice, and number of people a practitioner can work with at a time is also really helpful. So if a practitioner can work with 5 people, 10 people, If you're having like a group or ceremony, is there a maximum? Is it 20, 50, 100? 5. These are things that can be helpful to specify. And then the setting, they asked, can this be done in faith-based centers? Can it be done in healthcare centers and health clinics? Can it be done in homes or schools, et cetera? These are some recommended descriptions of settings. In this process, LA was specifically asking about the cultural relevance. That might be something that you want to include. They were asking about how the practice outreaches to the population it serves, what are the traditions, customs, and belief systems that are incorporated into the practice. They wanted to make sure that the practice had elements that were easily recognizable by the community as being important for wellness and well-being, that fits with that definition of community-defined evidence, that the community itself recognizes that the practice accepts the practice. So not just the clinic, not just the provider, but the community. So what are those elements that the community says, oh yeah, we agree, this is essential for well-being in our community. So to talk about those elements is helpful. Giving some, they wanted to know how do you know that the community trusts the practice, and then they wanted to know a little more about where kind of the origins of the practice. So those are some things that LA County was looking for in their process. Now, in LA, they wanted to know the indications of effectiveness. They didn't require it to be research-based. They wanted some kind of evidence of effectiveness. But they allowed people to give any kind of evidence, and here are some examples. I mean, you could go all the way up to experimental, that's research, or quasi-experimental, which are other research methodologies. But you can do you can do pre and post measures. You could have done it as a case study where you just describe a certain case. You could have just had post measures, like just ask people afterwards. You don't even know if there's been a difference. You just talk to them afterwards, or you get anecdotal reports or testimonials, people just saying what it's done for them. Any kind of evidence of effectiveness they were looking for in that process. But this is something that you can think about as you articulate your model, and we'll get into that in Module 2, how you build or the presentation of your evidence of effectiveness. Okay, so I gave you an example of what they were doing, what they were looking for to put practices into a guide. And this is an example of a listing of the guide that then the service areas in Los Angeles County reviewed these listings and then chose whether or not they wanted to implement a practice or not. So here's a practice. Terry Gok is going to be, Dr. Gok is going to be our faculty in our regional meeting. And this is an example of a practice that he got listed through LA County DMH. And there's a title to the program. There's a brief description of the program. You see here population, that's the target population. Look how it's defined. Middle school age Asian immigrant youth at high risk of substance abuse and other delinquent behaviors. You see that concrete, detailed description of the target population. So that's something that you refer back to this and think about how you would define your target population. In this listing, they wanted to talk about kind of the evidence that it works with communities. So here they just have it has already been implemented with youth, and they have specific evaluation measures that were developed and tested for the Asian immigrant population, so that the way they measured that it worked was culturally appropriate measures, is what it's saying. They were not using measures that didn't work for the population. So then, in this listing, since it was prevention and early intervention, they asked, what were the risk and protective factors? And so these are the risk and protective factors that this practice addresses. In a sense, this is part of the intended outcomes. When you read this, you can know, oh, what this practice does is it helps increase self-awareness. It helps enhance relationships with adults and pro-social peers. It increases school bonding, increases knowledge and use of pro-social skills. The outcomes are decreased substance use, decreased association with substance using peers, and decreased risk of using alcohol, tobacco, and other drugs. The two other things here are level of evidence and prevention. That's something that was used to kind of rank the practices in terms of the kind of research base and or other means of evidence. And so promising shows was something that was defined. If you looked at it in their guide, they would define what the promising is. And selective is using terminology and prevention. Is it indicated, selective, or universal? It's a type of prevention practice, and they're telling what type of prevention practice it is. So here's how the result of that previous questions that I showed you, these, Terry submitted this from the Asian Pacific Family Center, submitted this community-defined practice, and it got accepted and listed and made available for planning regions to choose to implement. And this is what it looked like. So I hope with this example, I mean, this is only one county and one process, and it doesn't generalize to all, but you can see how you can go from this process of articulating and how some funders are interested in your articulation of your practice, and then how they use that information to make that available for other people to make decisions about whether or not they should implement the practice. Okay, any questions before we go into the next phase, which is going to be I'm going to have you do another little exercise for a few minutes, and then we'll wrap up. Okay, I'm not seeing any questions right now. Now this, we won't have time to share, but this is what I'd like you to do as you start articulating your practice. Oh, and I do have a question, so let me go to the question first. So, okay, so Sinead was asking about this example that I gave, and it was asking about risk and protective factors, and how I said it was similar to the goal or the aim, and she was wondering, is that similar, and how do you articulate? Yes, the thing was that in the LA County listing, what they wanted to do is, because it was for prevention and early intervention, they wanted to have a section that specifically talked about risk and protective factors. They just listed those. And they did list them separately as the outcomes. So in that guide, they had these listed separately. But if you look at them as you're articulating your practice, these are both elements of articulating kind of the goal or the aim of the practice. So it's just that prevention practices, if you have a prevention practices are discussed sometimes in the system in terms of things called risk and protective factors. So if you're not familiar with risk and protective factors, I recommend that you look them up and look at a list of risk and protective factors if you want to use this to help translate your practice to the system language. Because risk and protective factors are things that have been found through research in our Western system to either increase the likelihood of developing mental illness or decrease the likelihood of developing mental illness. And so if you're trying to translate your practice to the system, if you see how it fits to these lists of risk and protective factors, if your practice, then you could indicate that if you wanted to. But remember, I recommended you start from within your cultural worldview. So you can list your intended outcomes from within the cultural worldview. You could use this to add your translation of your practice. Now, so for example, one thing that's really important for all community-defined evidence practices to think about is that there is a protective factor that has been found that is a positive cultural identity. It has been found in the Western research that if someone has a positive sense of their cultural identity, they are less likely to develop a mental illness. But if they have a weakened sense of their cultural identity, if they do not have a positive sense of cultural identity, then they are at higher risk of developing a mental illness. So cultural practices that strengthen their cultural identity based on that research, makes sense why they are important. And so if you want to build the case for your practice from a Western perspective, if you want to translate it, then you can list your aims of the practice in terms of the risk and protective factors, in addition to the aims of the practice that come out of your practice's worldview. So I hope that helps explain that. But not everyone who's participating here is doing just a prevention practice. Some folks are doing treatment practices as well. So this is just particularly in the world of prevention and early intervention. Prevention. Okay, great. So I'd like you to think about working on this. You know, I don't think we have too much time to do this, so maybe we have 5 minutes for you to take a stab right now at refining your definition of who your target population is, just in a few words. You don't have to submit it to me. Just jot down who's it for and under what circumstances. If you need to, go back to the slide on target population and use that as a guide from the LA process if you find that slide helpful. Jot down a few intended outcomes. You don't have time to get into the practice components, but you might start jotting down a little bit of, you know, how many practitioners are there, who are they? You know, like you need like again with the medical example, you need a surgeon, you need a nurse, you need I don't know everything. I don't know who all is needed in an OR because I'm not familiar with that practice. But there's there's more than one person in an OR, and they all have different roles. So who are the people that are needed in the practice, and what are the roles, and what type of setting? We'll just do that for a few minutes. This is only the beginning of doing this work, and some of you might already have this done. So if you already have it done for your practice, you've already done a good job at articulating your model, think about what you might add to your articulation if there's anything that's useful out of these questions to help enhance or refine your articulation of your model. And again, this is going to be available to you. You have it as a PowerPoint. So if you already have your model thought out, you can use this to help refine your articulation. Or if you haven't done this yet, then you can use this as a basis where you can keep on working on it. But even if you jot something down right now, if you haven't before, that might be helpful. Get going on this process. And we'll take just a couple more minutes, just giving you 5 minutes on this. And then we'll move on. Now, while we're doing this, I have a question for Jaime, and I don't know who else, but Jaime's indicated to me that he already has indicated to us he already has his practice articulated with the curriculums. So I wanted to ask Jaime, if you go back and look at the slides, is there anything that you're finding that that can enhance the articulation that you already have of your practice? Is there an area here that you're seeing that you could develop a little further. We also have a question from Lisa on how much longer we're going. So the webinar is scheduled to end at 12. I'm going to end this section in 1 more minute, and then I'm going to wrap up on the last slides, and the rest of the time will be discussion. So, Lisa, yeah, if you can hold on those 3 minutes, I think you'll be fine. We'll just be going to discussion. And it'll be good to hear from those of you who have already articulated your model and see areas here that you're finding that might help for enhancing the articulation, and those who have not, and seeing what you think about this. So let's move on. It's been the 5 minutes to get this started that I wanted to give you. So now I wanted to just kind of finalize the presentation and then end the rest of our time with the final discussion. Okay, so the next steps. What are the next steps for you? Bring the information that we've covered today back to your co-developers and discuss what you want to do next. So what I really want to say is this really has to, the guidance that we're giving here is just that. It's guidance. These are not things that you have to do in the way that we presented here. So we really want you to look at it and sort through it and sift through it and see what makes sense for your practice, for your community. So determine what you want to do next with this information. Do you want to work on articulating the theory of change? Do you feel that you need to do more around it? Do you need to refine that? Do you want to do that in a community process? So a group of folks, do you want to have to come together and work on that? What more do you want to think about articulating the model? Are there elements that we presented here that you think you do want to articulate? Which ones do you want to articulate? How do you want to go about doing it? So really spend some time to kind of think about what you want to do next. Look at the work, and I recommend you use whatever work you've done during this webinar for the theory of change and these last 5 minutes on articulating the model, and then bring what, and then do some work before the regional meeting if you can, because when you go to the regional meeting, you'll have an opportunity to share the work that you have and bring the material in a way that you can pass it on to someone else to read it and get guidance and feedback both from the instructor as well as from peers. So, and then of course, this is a journey. We want you to think of this as not something that gets done once, but can continue to refine and revise and improve. And so you can request additional TA from us if you're needed after the regional meeting. You feel you need additional help and support, all depending on where you are. So those are the next steps. And then the rest of the time that we have here is for questions and comments to discuss this. Up until we have about 20 minutes left. Okay, so Jaime says that, oh, and we heard from Roman. Okay. So let's see. First, Jaime, because I asked him a question to answer, and then we'll go to Roman. Okay. So Jaime, I think that this is a very complete and thorough. This approach is very detailed and helpful to guide us to cover all angles we develop our respective models. I think this process has great value. Oh, great. Thank you, Jaime. And I was wondering, are there certain areas that you're seeing that strike you right now that you see as areas that you might want to focus on in further refining your articulation of your practice? Anything jump out at you right now? And Lisa, thank you for joining us. I understand if you are have another commitment right now, so thank you for joining us. And then Roman, the Slavic community in Sacramento does not have any practice. Youth are using illegal drugs. We need to do prevention as well as treatment for this community. Okay, Roman, so we'll be talking more with you about that and seeing how we can support you. Okay, now, so Jaime is saying that from their perspective, they always emphasize that they bring it back to the values and cultural practices and how these are essential to the health and healing of their communities. So that's kind of the emphasis in the articulation of their practice, is really tying it to those cultural values and cultural practices. Excellent. Okay, great. That's good. That's good to hear. You've gone through this process of kind of manualizing your practice and articulating it, and yet it sounds like that you're saying you found that you're able to do that in such a way where you really tie it to the cultural values and the cultural practices and try not to lose that element of it, even though you're doing this kind of translation work. Great. What other observations do people have? Is there someone here who is not, oh wait, there are more comments, so let me see. Gulshan is also leaving. Okay, that's thank you, Gulshan, for joining us. Is someone who has not articulated their practice yet to quite this degree? I was wondering how this, what you thought about this information in terms of the idea of articulating your practice. Is this something that seems like is counter to your practice? Will it be hard to do? Or is this something that you see some areas that you could do some articulation of your practice? That would be helpful to hear both from practices that have already been well articulated and those practices that this is new. Okay, so Bruce is saying that he thinks in some contexts to maintain the cultural value, so the content may need to be articulated in the literature or advertising the program. So that's his question. So yes, articulation of the practice. That's exactly right, Bruce. This is not what you use necessarily to communicate the practice to community members who will use the practice. This articulation process is a translation practice to, as you say, to advertise the program. It is to advertise it to potential funders or other implementers. It's also the basis for helping you, as Jaime was saying, helping you. It could be the basis, if that's how it is in your culture, to transmit the practice to others. Again, recognizing in some cultures they have ways of doing that in an oral tradition through kind of an apprenticeship or mentorship system. But for some communities, articulating is key to also disseminating. So yes, all this articulation is about really communicating to potential funders. It is a translation exercise. However, there are some community members who may also like to know who might come from a Western system perspective and feel that they also want to know this information. So you'll feel that there are people who are different levels of acculturation, let's say, to use that terminology, to the system. How much they've been brought into the system, and there'll be some people, some families, some community members who might be interested in knowing some of this information as well. Okay, and I'm hearing from Sinead that she's feeling that this will be helpful for articulating, this framework will be helpful for articulating the practice. So they will be using it and then contacting us for follow-up. Okay, great. Thanks to hear. Good to hear that, Sinead. Okay, anyone else? We don't have to go to 12. I'm just having the time available. I'm hearing a few people have had to leave. So let's see. And Sinead is saying, Jaime is saying that that our model should be formulated keeping in mind the best interest of the community, youth, and families, and how it will be welcomed, and that it's true to the reality and needs of the youth, families, and community that we want to work with. We need to ask, not assume that we know what their needs are, but the community will let you know if the trust has been established. Yes. Jaime, that's the thing. I think the trick is really trying to maintain that connection to the community. For a community to find practice, you really have to come from the community and address the needs of the community. I think that's a great point that you're making, and being true to the community. Sinead is saying that they have been presenting their practice they have been doing presentations, but that this articulation will help simplify kind of that presentation, clarify the practice itself. Okay, great. And Roman's talking about they have a particular subgroup in their community, the elderly who are experiencing depression and isolation, and there's a need for really articulating, developing programs that really help that target population, like ones that bring that connection, peer clubs and support groups that help reduce their isolation and their depression. And it helps that these peer groups help, peer clubs help, they could be even something that brings people together around some, like some employment, like doing some assembling. They come together and do some assembly work. So that might be able to bring income, but also increase their self-esteem and their emotional well-being. Okay, great, Roman. So that's a practice that might tie into some cultural tradition for the Slavic communities of gathering together, the elderly gathering together around something, and you could tie it to that. It could come out of that tradition, and then what we would be doing is what you would be doing is articulating that, and we can help you with that. But that sounds good. You've identified the target community. You got a sense of what the community practice is. This way of people coming together in these clubs. That's probably a cultural tradition. And then what you would do is help articulate it so that you could get support for that practice. Okay, great. So that's good. We're hearing from various levels of already having defined the practice, and it sounds like this framework might be able to help you. Any other comments before we close or questions? Okay, great. And Roman's also letting us know that this is something that they have been doing and they know it works. So great. So this is where we're in that situation of where you want to be able to, it sounds like you want to be able to articulate so that you can get funding or support for the practice. Perfect. That sounds good. No one else? Okay, well, I really appreciate you taking the time to join us. And if you were not able to join us in person now and are listening to this as a recording, I hope it's been beneficial. Look forward to seeing you at the regional meetings where we can continue to progress in terms of articulation, refining the articulation of your practice. I hope you find it helpful. Jaime has one other comment. And he says that they have been bringing workshops to acknowledge the importance of elders and their value stories and teachings and teach the wisdom of the elders. Ah, okay, Jaime, that's good. So you're letting Roman know that in your community, Jaime, this idea of bringing elders together to share their stories and their wisdom and their teaching is something that works. And maybe, Roman, that's something that might work, that works in your community as well. This kind of recognizing the wisdom of the elders and giving them a venue to share their wisdom. Okay, and then Bruce was asking about when the regional meeting schedule. We'll send all that information to you all. Make sure you all have it if you don't have it already. So you'll be getting that today. We'll make sure, because we want to make sure everyone has that. So if you don't, let us know. Okay, and I think that's it. Really appreciate you all for being with us today, and look forward to seeing you in the regional meetings or additional TA that we can provide you. And again, really, let's focus on what it is that you need for your community and your practice, to the extent that you want to help translate that. How far do you want to go in this or not? Let's see what's right for you and how we can support you. Okay, take care, everyone. We'll be in touch. Look forward to continuing working with you and supporting your dissemination of your practices.